All right. Good afternoon. It is Friday. Happy Friday. We have today is just an amazing day all around. And let me tell you why. If you're tuning in, you know that this is our kickoff event for our news match. My name is Schlonn Hawkins. I'm the CEO and publisher of Shelterforce. And November 1st to December 31st, is our annual giving campaign that is matched, thankful for the great partnership with NewsMatch. So we are really excited about this season, if you will. But more importantly, today we are excited because we have this amazing kickoff event where I have my wonderful new friend and colleague, Miss Marisol Bello. So please do us the honor and introduce yourself.
Super. Thank you so much, Schlonn. I am super excited to be here and chatting with you today and talking about Shelterforce and the election and all the things housing related around that. But my name is Marisol Bello. I'm the executive director of the Housing Narrative Lab. And the Housing Narrative Lab's work, we are a national organization, and our work is all around how do we build the public support and the public will for the housing solutions that help all of our communities, that make our communities vibrant and healthy and strong, because we know, you and I and everyone that's hanging out with us during their lunch hour,
Mhm.
we know that housing is foundational to a really strong, thriving community. So this work that we are all doing and engaging in becomes so foundational to the kind of places where we live.
Yeah, I am so excited about the conversation. If you're just tuning in, we are talking with Marisol Bello with the Housing Narrative Lab as a form of creating some excitement around the preservation of democracy and journalism, as we kick off Shelterforce kicks off our annual giving campaign. So we'd like to get started with our discussion on housing under the next election. Marisol, can you believe we are days away? You and I were just talking about how we were going to end our day today a little bit early and head out to do some early voting. So there's a lot of things um, that are on the line and are part of the conversation. And specifically, I really am looking forward to this conversation around housing. How should people be talking about housing? And what are some things that you think that we should be looking out for as we get closer to this election? And I would love to talk a little bit about what are the things towards once we pass the election, what are some things that we should be talking about and preparing for, either way that it could go?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing, Schlon, I will say I have my plan for voting. And I also hope that everyone else, I love to hear your plan. You're going to go today. I'm actually going to go tomorrow.
Oh, you're
So
going tomorrow. Okay, I'm
going
sorry.
tomorrow. It's all good. It's all good. And making sure that I bring my kid with me, because I think it's so important for all of us to really exercise our responsibility for each other by voting. So encouraging everyone to have a voting plan.
Mm,
Um, but the thing that has struck me so much about this election is how really, for the first time in recent memory, housing is a top issue. It is a top concern. It is a top tier issue for voters, for everyone, right? Because we're seeing so many of us that are just struggling to keep a roof over our heads, right? Rent is really high for so many people that are renters. Rent is just high. So people are really having to make some deep choices about paying the rent and how they're going to pay for enough food on the table, how they're going to pay for their insurance, how they're going to pay for all the other bills that
right.
kind of are growing for all of us. And then for homeowners, right, we know that it's harder and harder for people to buy that starter home, or for people that already have a home to move to other places, right? And switch off, just because the housing market is just so tight and so hard right now. And so because of all of these cascading elements,
Right.
housing's become a top tier voting issue for all of us. And we're seeing it play out in two ways. And for folks, if you haven't read these stories in Shelterforce, I really urge you to go look at it, because what we're seeing with the election is really, you all did these great series of stories about, number one, how it's shown up with the presidential election, how the candidates are talking about housing. We see this so clearly, right? So we can talk more about that in a moment, but one way that it's playing out is that the presidential candidates are talking about it. That's not something that they've talked about
Mm.
so directly and so consistent. That's the first. And then the second is that we are seeing this, something like almost 40 ballot measures at the local and state level that are all about housing. And I think it was Lillian Ortiz, your managing editor, who did this great series of this great story that outlined all of the ballot measures. So if y'all, no matter where you are in the country, you're taking a look, go to Shelterforce and go look at what is on the ballot in your particular community, because it really outlines it. And we're seeing that these local and state ballot measures vary drastically, from providing more funding for housing and for homelessness services and shelter, all the way through tenant protections and rent control. So we're seeing the gamut in those in the ballot measures. So that's how that's what I'm seeing is playing out. I didn't
So
see it for DC, which is where I'm located, but I think North Carolina might have something on the books.
So, as someone who is a proponent of narrative, and we are a publication that does a really great job of lifting up the issues and elevating the issues. But what we hear consistently, on the ground, in conversations when we're talking about community change and action, is about narrative. How should we tell our stories, right? And so like I said, you are a champion for narrative, specifically around housing. So how can folks better tell their story at this particular important time in our country?
Yeah, Schlonn, thank you so much for that. It's so critical. And part of why I love having this conversation is because I was a long time journalist myself. And so storytelling is so embedded in all of the work that we do at the lab, and why I love Shelter Force so much. And I would say a few things. One is that it is so important for us to be able to tell stories from a lived experience. And by that, I mean two things. One is from the voices from the people that are directly impacted,
Mm.
because any of our solutions need to be led by the people that are at the heart of it and that are experiencing it. And so the first thing I would say is that how important that mix of voices is, I think, is really, really a critical piece, because storytelling is just how we connect, how we relate to each other, right, as people. So who is telling the story, who gets to tell the story, is really important. That's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing that I would say is that in housing,
Yeah.
we sometimes fall into this bureaucratic, wonky policy speak,
Mm.
that when we're talking to ourselves and to each other and to other maybe advocates and insiders in the space who do this work, we get it. We
We
can
get it.
speak that shorthand. We can use the acronyms. We can talk about LITEC until we're blue in the face, right? We get all of those pieces. But when we're talking to folks that are experiencing the housing crunch in very real pocketbook ways, but they're not in our world, and we start talking about LITEC, they kind of look at us like, I don't even know what you're talking about. But when we start to talk about how all of us are struggling to pay the rent because it's going too high, all of us, housing is a basic need.
Mm.
Housing is foundational to the strong communities that we need to thrive and to be healthy. when we talk about it in those kinds of real world ways, right? Folks get it. And then the aha will be, the aha light will go on and like, oh yeah, I'm feeling that 100%. So we should then be, kind of engaging in this a little bit more. But a lot of it is about how we are thinking and talking about housing. And we tend to get a little policy driven in how we are talking about the stories. And that's not the way that most people are going to connect to it because, they're feeling it every day in their lives, right? And I think that's really important. I think the other piece of it is that when we can tell stories about how important housing is as a basic need, how foundational it is to our communities, that helps people to see it as the basic need that it is, and that needs public investment, for example, right? And the resources to be able to provide it versus housing as a commodity, because
Mm,
too often people are thinking housing is a commodity, like a pair of sneakers. The more
right.
money you have, the nicer the sneakers are that you can afford to buy.
Mm,
That's not the same with housing, but too often as a society, we treat it that way. So we need to tell the stories that show how foundational it is to our families thriving and our communities.
mm.
Okay.
I love that. So when we think about, you know, it could go either way in regards of the outcome of the election. What would you advise folks to regard? So we can take one if it goes one way, if it goes the right way, or if it goes the left way. How can we advise folks to talk about their story in a way that will resonate, you know what I mean? Because there is a perception that one, you know what I mean? There's a how can I say this? I'm trying, I don't want to, you know what I mean? I get in trouble here. But,
No,
I
we're
guess,
C3. Everyone here is, we are for educational purposes and giving people sort of
right.
the lay of the
So, I
land of
mean,
what's what.
there is the perception that, one cares more than the other, right? And so when it
Mhm.
comes to the issues that matter to the people that you and I are talking about or serving or that sort of thing, right? So how can we best in either climate talk about the needs of the community as it pertains to housing? Because one of the things that you said and one of the things that we know is that, housing is one of the top issues of this country because at this particular juncture, it is affecting everyone. It doesn't matter your social economic status, it is affecting or making an impact with everyone. So, how would we advise them? Or how would you
Yeah,
advise them?
absolutely, and 100%. And the first thing I will say is that I think it's important for folks to understand that the two candidates at the presidential level have very different approaches
Right.
to the problem. There seems to be agreement, right, that the problem is that we don't have enough housing, right? Housing is out of reach, and housing that people can afford, right, is out of reach. So it's we have significant supply problem. I think maybe that's where maybe the some of the potential agreements begin and end. But what I will first want to just outline some of the differences in approaches that I think are important to name for folks. Because you mentioned something, Schlonn, about how there's a perception that one cares over the other, and I would add to that I would talk about the approaches being very different, right?
Hmm.
And the first I will say is that um, Harris has Vice President Harris has a detailed roadmap for policies that are really about expanding access to housing. And Donald Trump has ideas, but we haven't seen a specificity in some of that. So maybe I'll just kind of talk a little bit about high level, some of those ideas.
Mhm.
I'll kick off with Harris first. Right? We've seen that Harris is talking about a couple of things. One is offering first-time homeowners $25,000 in down payment assistance, because we know, especially since the Great Recession, it's really hard for people to get that down payment going to be
Right.
able to buy a house. That may come with some series of challenges on its own, according to economists, if it's not combined with a big rapid increase in the supply of housing, right? So it may just, if there's no supply of housing work that's being done, it's going to shoot up some costs. And so there needs to be a little bit of a balance there, though. Harris is also talking about providing tax incentives for builders, the what we talked about with LIHTC, right? Doing some expansion of those tax credits, and really also doing some providing more federal funds for construction, right, to speed up construction. All told, with the varying policies, Harris says that in the next 4 years, she's looking at increasing the number of housing units by 2 to 3 million. I think it might be up to 3 million. 3 million. Trump's approach is a little bit different, right? And so he's talking about things like tax incentives for home buyers, so not necessarily the down payments that Harris is talking about cutting unnecessary regulations on home construction. Again, we're not really sure what that actually means, because there's not a lot of detail. Talking about reducing inflation. And one of the pieces that I do want to lift up that has struck me as curious about how he wants to deal with the housing problem is, in his mind, reducing the demand piece by mass deportations. And I
Mm.
want to just kind of name that because economists are questioning that on a couple of levels. One is that often people who are in this country without the proper documentation, they can't really, get leases. So they're doubled up with other people who are here with the proper documentation, and they are the ones with the leases. So it doesn't kind of connect. And then on the other end, we also know that a pretty significant the labor industry around construction, a pretty significant number of people that work in construction are people who are foreign born. And so
Mm.
there is a concern from economists that then the very people you need to build the housing may be moved out of the country. So I think that it's really important for folks, before we kind of start to see like that, they're going to be, depending on who is there, it's really going to be rooted right in the approaches. And so there are some significant concerns that folks have if Trump is elected, because um, actually, I should probably also mention Project 2025, which I think many people are kind of familiar with at this point. But, that's going to, if that is the path that Trump is going to go down, that's going to have some pretty significant impact on all of the service providers and the folks that are
Right.
working to help people be housed. Things like dismantling Housing First. I think, the audience for Shelter First is pretty familiar with Housing First. And we also know that it's evidence-based, it's an evidence-based solution, providing people housing first, and then the services they need to get on the path to well-being. Project 2025, if that is the direction that Trump goes in, would eliminate that. It would do things like shift HUD, right, to be
Right.
more of a development profit-making arm of the federal government. So there are some significant concerns in that direction. We have seen from Harris's approach that there is more potential and intentionality around providing housing for the people that need it the most.
Mm. So thank you for that, Marisol, with the breakdown, the high level breakdown, very informative. But with the different approaches, we are November 6th. And so if we're in, one approach versus the other, what do folks who are that need to tell the story to
Yeah.
keep the resources flowing, to keep the awareness, to keep, you know, progressing on the ground, What should they be, what and how should they be
Yeah.
tackling this when it comes to narrative?
Yeah. So I think for the answer is the same for both, but the conversation may need to shift a little bit, right? And the
Mhm.
framing may need to shift. So, for example, we have if Harris is elected president, let me back up. When we think about advancing any kind of narrative, we need
Right,
three things: scale, consistency, and repetition. Scale, all of us. Consistency, right? Saying similar things,
right,
repetition over and over and over
right,
again. So that doesn't change regardless of who is going to be the president,
right,
but it does mean that we need to organize much more, right? So service providers, developers who are providing low-income housing, um, local governments that are in the mind of wanting to provide people with, housing they can afford.
right,
Um, people with lived experience, all of us organizing to tell stories about how housing is a basic need, to tell stories about how housing is foundational for all of our communities to thrive, to tell stories about how, frankly, we all need housing that we can afford. And so it becomes even more critical
hmm,
for us if there is a Trump administration, if Trump becomes the president, for all of us, um, there's gonna be more of an outside game. We're gonna need to organize people. We need to organize renters. We need to organize potential first-time homeowners to be able to join together to say this is something that is impacting folks regardless of their politics,
absolutely.
right? Because if you're stranded on a deserted island, and it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, a Democrat, progressive, or conservative, the first thing you're going to go look for is a safe place, right? You're going to look for shelter for yourself. That cuts party lines. And so we need to be able to organize with impacted people and people that are doing this work so much more deeply. The conversation shifts a little bit if, excuse me, if Vice President Harris is elected, not because we're not going to organize, because we will, but we are going to have a possibly a slightly more receptive audience to be able to have those conversations. So it's more about the what the reception is going to be, but the organizing has to be similar, and
Right.
we can organize around those shared narratives that we hold.
Right. No, I mean the first thing I thought about was we just got to band together, and I
Yes.
think that that message is so critical because in this space, in this work, sometimes we can be siloed, and one of the things that as a publication that we try to do is to be that bridge
Yes.
through information, right? Because what we know is housing intersects with every single thing. There is nothing that we do or touch that does not have an impact on housing. And so what are some of the things that
100%.
Housing Narrative Lab is doing to also be a bridge or to, help bring folks together?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Schlonn, so much because 100% to everything, right? Housing touches everything. You cannot be a child and do your homework if you don't
Absolutely
have
not.
a safe place to do your homework. And I know that you know all about education because you work so deeply in that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't be a family. You can't be an individual. You can't have a job if you don't have a right and be able to do that job well,
Right.
right? And productively if you don't have a place to go home at night and be able to go to sleep safely. So it just touches. There's nothing that it doesn't touch. And so part of why it's so great that we're having this conversation together is because we think about very much how A, that intersection happens, and B, how because that intersection is there, we have to work together across all of, as you
Right.
described so rightly, the silos, right? And so when I talk about the work that the lab does, I break it out into four buckets. One is the narrative research, right? It's evidence based. It's like, what are the attitudes, the values that people hold about housing so that we can then be able to have conversations from their starting places.
Mm,
Second, right, that's really important, right?
very.
The second is we do a lot of education training around this very thing. And then the third is helping people to implement it. How do you tell your story? Where do you tell your story? What does that look like, right? Am I telling stories on LinkedIn? Am I writing, am I creating a video? Are we doing social media? How do we best reach the people that we want to reach? But the last one, the fourth leg of that chair or stool is building coalition and collaboration.
Right,
Because, I started earlier saying the way we advance narrative is scale, consistency, and repetition. That means all of us need to be moving in similar directions. And it's not that we're going to be matchy matchy, right?
right.
But that we are moving in similar directions, telling stories about how education is impacted if we don't have a home, or how our students do better in school when they have a home.
Stable
There
home,
was this
absolutely.
fascinating study that just came out in the last week, and I'm gonna not remember exactly who it was, but I'll give you the top line of it, which is basically that families that had lawyers in eviction um, processes, right? In the legal process of evictions, when they had lawyers, there was a deep connection to better health outcomes.
Hmm,
And it was fascinating, fascinating because it showed so clearly that your health outcomes were tied to having a home,
absolutely. Yeah.
and they were able to tie, it was a university, I want to say it was either in Colorado or California, but they were so clearly able to tie how if you have a lawyer, if you're going through an eviction process who helps you not get evicted, your health outcomes are going to be that much better. Shows you so clearly,
I
right?
mean,
How all of our
but
work is intersected.
I mean, that tracks because you have someone else advocating on your behalf, right? And so that takes the alleviation off of you know what I mean? And any pressure, anxiety, stress, those sorts of things all impact our health. And so that tracks also too with, how housing is a social determinants of health, right? Like,
Correct.
you can't have one
Yeah.
without the other.
That's right. And which
um,
is why those silos don't do us any good, right?
exactly.
The silos, it's like, I
Exactly.
only work with individuals. I only work in the shelter system. I only work providing affordable low income housing. It's like all of these things are
Touch, touch,
super
impact one
connected.
another. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um,
Yeah. Which is why it's so important for us to be able to tell our narratives.
right,
Definitely from the perspective of our work. We all are working on different solutions to, right, the vision of all of us having a safe place to
safe
live,
place to
to the
live.
vision that we housing is foundational to our communities, right? That those are the ultimate visions. We all can work on our varying pieces, the shelter system, short term to get people on a path, just to get them out of the immediate crisis. Then
Right.
eventually we move them to the permanent housing piece. All of those stories can be told as a continuum. They don't have to exist separately.
Right. I love that. I do want to touch on because you talked about the education, and I want to let folks that are tuning in know that in the next couple of weeks, Shelterforce will be dropping another series, another Under the Lens series, where we dive deep in specific topics. And this particular topic is going to be talking and addressing the intersectionality between education and housing. And this is a passion of mine because what we found is that housing, folks that are working to around affordable housing and community development and making sure that communities are thriving, aren't necessarily talking to the school districts. And so what we also found too is that, when you close down a school, it destabilizes the neighborhood. That was something that was very fascinating to me, because for me, it gives me a visual of a school closing down and what that means when we say destabilizing the community, right? So you have displacement, you have children that have to be bused to different areas, you have parents that have to try to figure it out You know what I mean? When it comes
Yes.
to changing schools and schools is community. So you create families with your teachers and your administrators and those sorts of things. So when you talk about destabilizing, it gives me a visual like never before. So if you guys, I'm sorry, if you are tuning in, please make sure and watch for Shelterforce's Underland series that will be coming out in the next couple of weeks around education and this intersectionality with housing. So
I love
Marisol,
that. I'm looking forward to it.
thank you. I also want to bring this full circle around even why we are having this conversation today. And this is something that you shared. And I think, we kind of glossed over it, but your background is in journalism. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey um, as a journalist?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I was a career journalist, almost 25 years, as a 25 years almost as a career journalist. And it's interesting because I'm originally from New York City, from the Bronx, and I am the product of a first generation family, immigrant family from the Dominican Republic. And so, for those of you that know the Dominican Republic, it is full of a lot of storytellers who love to tell our stories. And but I grew up in New York at a time when I will say to you, Schlonn, that I would see these stories about my community and the people in my community, and they were showing up as like moochers of the system, taking
Mm,
advantage of the system, victims, violence, drugs. There was like this whole narrative. And I was kind of like, whoa, I don't know that. My dad owns a grocery store and he works from like 4 in the morning until 12 at night. I mean, midnight. My dad hardly slept for. So, so I didn't see like the actual folks in my community represented. And so I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a journalist so I could tell those stories, tell the stories of
mm,
the people that were like on the ground, whose stories were not told in mainstream, particular mainstream journalism media. And so I worked in mainstream newspapers. I was a newspaper reporter. I worked in Detroit. I worked in Philadelphia. I worked in Pittsburgh. When I left journalism, I was a reporter and then an editor at USA Today. So I also worked at the national level. And one of the things that after that long career in journalism, I realized was that I wanted to I saw how in our work, we didn't always use storytelling. We did tell
mm,
stories, but in our spaces, in nonprofit spaces, we could tell our stories more clearly and more strongly. And I wanted to do that work. I wanted to engage. I wanted to bring that passion that I have for telling stories into being able to tell our work. And so I worked for communications. I was the communications director for a national social justice organization. And then I became the first executive director of the Housing Narrative Lab 4 years ago or yeah, 4 years ago now. It's been when the lab more or
oh,
less
wait, 4 years
started.
ago?
Yeah, so I came onto the lab in 2021 as its first executive director, and the lab was started in 2020. And it was really started because there was there was this sort of thinking, high level research and high level thinking happening around how how do we move housing from thinking about it as a commodity to a basic need that requires public investment, right? And public resources. And that conversation very much led to how we were thinking about um, how housing insecurity and homelessness, right, were a part of that story, and how we just really needed
Mm,
to really think more deeply and more consistently, right? Not deeply, that was not the right word, but to continue to think more deeply and to be able to provide more resources for people to implement narrative, right? Because
mm,
we have been doing a lot of work around narrative and why narrative. And now there's a lot of folks that are getting those connections and how we really need to think about how we tell our stories. But it's hard, I think, sometimes for folks to say, well, how do we do that? Right? Like
yeah.
you're thinking about the race. It's like, a marathon, for example, right? We have a lot of folks that can, folks like the Case Made, who are amazing partners of ours. And I believe Dr. T may be on your, was on
Yes,
your
Dr. T is
board
our
and
board
still
chair.
is, is on your, exactly. You know, folks like Dr. T and the Case Made, right? They really like get people on the journey. They help you plan it out and get you on it. And then the lab comes in and we're like, okay, we're going to start running this with you and get you over, right, over the finish line, like the actual, the implementation pieces of it. And so that's where kind of the role of the lab has really been able to engage, because you know we realize there's such a breadth of challenges around housing and how people are thinking about housing.
Right,
Um, and so all of us working together
right,
can really help to affect the change that needs to happen. You know, we have great with just partners everywhere. You know, I think of folks like Invisible People who are
mm,
really digging in on the
yeah,
the the piece of like creating the content and
yes,
getting it out there to the world very specifically from the place of people that are experiencing it on the
absolutely.
street. So there's we all exist in this like really strong ecosystem. And I would say we all exist in an ecosystem that's becoming stronger and stronger as we are working more together to be able to kind of move in a similar direction. Shelterforce clearly has such a strong role in that ecosystem, right? So you can see that we're kind of approaching it from lots of different places, but moving in similar directions.
Right. So you mentioned a lot of partners and partners that we have as well. And as a journalist and your support of Shelterforce, tell folks that are tuning in why do you specifically read Shelterforce?
Yeah. So so many reasons. Okay, I will say first, Shelterforce sits in such a unique place. It is the place to understand and to know what's happening in housing at every level,
Mm,
from housing in politics, housing as it connects to climate change. We
mm,
see, for example, in Florida, tons of insurance providers, they're pulling out. We see the impact of climate change, right? It's going to happen probably in North Carolina. We're going to just keep seeing it everywhere. If you want the ins and outs, Shelterforce is a place to go. Redlining, right? I saw that great piece. Can't remember actually when it ran, but you know, we all understand the maps, the redlining maps, and the influence that they've had on how different communities have been segregated. But y'all did a piece that really dug in to the realities of like what the true impact of those redlining maps are, right?
mm,
So really
mhm.
getting to the nuances of some of those. And I found that fascinating. So for those of us that really need to dig in to the nuances and the details of housing, Shelterforce provides that. For those of us that need to understand the top lines of housing, Shelterforce provides that. And I often liken Shelterforce to other outlets that focus on specific topics, like the Marshall Project. The Marshall Project is a journalistic endeavor that focuses on the criminal justice system and
Right.
specifically people that are
That's
incarcerated.
good. Mhm.
Chalkbeat, right? Chalkbeat focuses on journalistic endeavor also that focuses on education.
Education. Mhm.
Um, Kaiser, right? Kaiser Public News or Public Health Service focuses on health, right? Now, all things health. Shelterforce is that space for housing and really kind of helping people understand housing at a much deeper level.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Marisol. And so I'd like to encourage folks that if you are not a subscriber of Shelter Force, to go ahead and subscribe, and we'll put the link below this conversation. But more importantly, for all of the reasons that Marisol most eloquently shared just now, please give to Shelter Force now. Between now and December 31st, all of your donations will be matched. And it is unrestricted dollars, which means that we can use it for anything within Shelterforce to help continue to do this great work that you all tune in to read on a weekly basis. We are on a growth trajectory. We want to be able to give our readers exactly what you're asking for, which is more. And so, in order to do more, it takes the resources. So, please give to us today for all of the reasons that Marisol said, and then more importantly, for the preservation of democracy and how, my staff and I pride ourselves in uplifting the stories um, of the communities that are most impacted when it comes to affordable housing, housing justice, and community development, and what I like to say, community building. So please, again, give to us today. And Marisol, if there, do you have anything else to share before we close out our wonderful conversation this afternoon?
Yeah, I definitely, folks need to sign up. Independent media is so important. It is important now more than ever. It is really, I hold my journalism roots strong. And so
Mm-hmm.
that idea of shining a light in darkness to me is not just a saying, it's like real, right? I mean, it's so important around journalism. And then I will say two other things. One is that how important it is as we are moving forward, regardless of the outcome of this election day. We have to work together. We have to build
Absolutely.
coalitions. We have to work in collaboration because it really is the only way to shift the narrative, to build the public support that we need, recognizing that all of us sit in different places and that is okay. And not only is that okay, it's a strength, right? That
Right,
we then can kind of work together for. And then the last thing I will say is that as viewers and as organizations are thinking about their own work and how to advance narrative in their own work, I urge you to take a look at the Housing Narrative Lab's website. We have a plethora of resources on how to engage in narrative, how to think about narrative, how to create strategy around narrative. And it includes the latest research, national research that the lab conducted earlier this year with the National Homelessness Law Center that really kind of help people think about how are we shaping narrative, particularly around the current housing challenges that we
right,
face, the current situation with homelessness and the reactions. We really didn't kind of dig too much into that, but the reactions that cities are having and the reactions that cities are taking to address homelessness, and in some cases are the arresting and fining
yeah.
of people that are being forced out on the street is actually going to make homelessness worse, and we need to tell that story. So if you look on our website, we have some good resources to be able to engage in that direction. And then I would say, Schlonn, thank you so much. I love
Yeah.
having this like Friday lunch chat with you. It
Yeah,
was wonderful.
absolutely. I love this. Thank you so much, Marisol, for joining us today. And I would encourage everyone to do what it is that you need to do, which is to vote. But more importantly, today, right now, is to give to Shelterforce, so that we continue to be that bridge and to um, move the narrative when it comes to housing and community development. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and have a wonderful, wonderful Friday. Thank you, Marisol.
Thank you. Thank you,
Take care.
everyone. Thank you, Schlonn.